Let yourself settle in, take a deep breath, and let's journey back to Vienna in the late 1800s, where a young doctor named Sigmund Freud was about to change how we think about the human mind forever. Freud was born on May 6, 1856, in a small town called Freiburg, in what is now the Czech Republic. His family was Jewish, and when he was just 4 years old, they moved to Vienna, the grand imperial city that would become his home for most of his life. Picture the gaslit streets, the coffee houses filled with intellectuals, the orchestra music drifting through the evening air. This was the world that shaped young Sigmund. As a student, Freud was brilliant, intensely curious about everything. He initially studied medicine at the University of Vienna, but what truly fascinated him wasn't just the body, it was the mysterious connection between body and mind. In the 1880s, he spent time in Paris studying under the renowned neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, who was using hypnosis to treat patients with what they called hysteria. Watching these demonstrations, Freud began to wonder, what if physical symptoms could have psychological causes? When Freud returned to Vienna, he started his private practice in 1886, specializing in nervous disorders. But he found hypnosis unpredictable and difficult. So he began developing a new technique, one that would become his most famous contribution. He called it free association. Instead of hypnotizing patients, he simply asked them to lie on a couch, to relax, and to say whatever came to mind, no matter how trivial or embarrassing it seemed. The couch itself became iconic, a safe space where people could let their minds wander freely. Through thousands of hours listening to his patients, Freud made a revolutionary observation. He believed that the human mind was like an iceberg. The conscious mind, the thoughts and feelings you're aware of right now, that's just the tip floating above the water. But beneath the surface lies something much larger, the unconscious mind. This vast hidden realm, Freud proposed, contains all our forgotten memories, our repressed desires, our deepest fears, everything we've pushed away because it was too painful or socially unacceptable to acknowledge. And here's where Freud's theory gets fascinating. He believed the unconscious mind doesn't just sit there passively. It's constantly influencing our behavior in ways we don't realize. Have you ever said something you didn't mean to say? Or forgotten someone's name at just the wrong moment? Freud would say these aren't accidents, they're Freudian slips, moments when the unconscious breaks through and reveals what you're really thinking or feeling. He published a whole book about this in 1901, called The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, filled with examples of how our hidden thoughts leak out in small, everyday mistakes. But Freud went even further. He proposed that the mind could be divided into three parts, three forces constantly in tension with each other. There's the ID, the most primitive part, present from birth, driven entirely by pleasure and desire, demanding immediate gratification like a hungry infant. Then there's the superego, which develops as we grow up and internalize society's rules, our conscience, always judging, criticizing, telling us what we should and shouldn't do. And caught between these two opposing forces is the ego, the part of you that has to navigate reality, trying to satisfy the ID's desires while keeping the superego happy and dealing with the actual world around you. Imagine these three parts as voices in your head, constantly negotiating. The ID says, "I want that piece of cake right now." The superego says you shouldn't, you're supposed to be eating healthy. And the ego tries to find a compromise, maybe just a small piece, or perhaps waiting until after dinner. Freud believed that much of our mental distress comes from the conflicts between these three parts of ourselves. Now let your mind drift for a moment. Picture Freud in his study, surrounded by his collection of ancient artifacts. Egyptian statues, Greek figurines, listening intently as another patient speaks, gradually piecing together his grand theory of the human psyche, a theory that would spark both admiration and controversy for generations to come. As you relax deeper into comfort, let's explore one of Freud's most controversial and fascinating ideas, the theory that made even his closest colleagues uncomfortable. Freud believed that sexuality wasn't something that suddenly appeared in adolescence, but rather, that we are sexual beings from the very beginning of life. In 1905, he published a book called 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality, and it scandalized Viennese society. What could he possibly mean by childhood sexuality? Well, Freud used the term in a broader sense than we usually think. He meant that from infancy, we seek pleasure through our bodies, and that this develops in stages. He proposed that children move through what he called psychosexual stages of development. The first stage, from birth to about 18 months, he called the oral stage, when an infant's pleasure centers on the mouth, sucking, feeding, exploring the world by putting things in their mouth. Picture a baby contentedly nursing, or a toddler chewing on everything they can reach. Then comes the anal stage, from about 18 months to 3 years, when toilet training becomes the focus, and the child experiences pleasure and control through retention and release. Freud believed that how parents handle these early stages could shape personality for life, that someone who experienced harsh toilet training, for example, might become overly controlling or orderly as an adult. Around age 3 to 6 comes what Freud called the phallic stage, and this is where he introduced his most infamous concept, the Oedipus complex. Named after the Greek tragedy where Oedipus unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother, Freud proposed that young boys develop unconscious romantic feelings toward their mothers, and see their fathers as rivals. Now, before this sounds too disturbing, remember, Freud believed this was completely unconscious and normal, a natural stage that children work through. He thought boys eventually resolve this by identifying with their fathers, internalizing masculine traits and moral values. For girls, he proposed something similar, which he called the Electra complex, though he was less confident about his theories regarding female development. Let your breathing slow. As we move through time, after the phallic stage, Freud believed children enter a period of calm he called the latency stage, roughly from age 6 until puberty begins. During these years, sexual impulses are dormant. Children focus on school, friendships, hobbies, building skills and knowledge. It's a peaceful interlude before the storm of adolescence. Then comes the final stage, the genital stage, beginning at puberty and lasting throughout adulthood. This is when, if development has proceeded normally, a person becomes capable of mature, intimate relationships. Freud believed that the goal of psychological development was to reach this stage with the ability to love and work, to form genuine connections with others while pursuing meaningful goals. But Freud knew that development didn't always proceed smoothly. He observed that when people experience trauma or extreme stress at a particular stage, they might become fixated there, stuck, in a sense, unconsciously returning to the behaviors and concerns of that earlier time. An adult who constantly seeks oral gratification through smoking, overeating, or even excessive talking might be fixated at the oral stage. Someone obsessed with cleanliness and order might be fixated at the anal stage. These fixations, Freud believed, were the unconscious mind's way of trying to resolve unfinished business from childhood. Now, here's something that reveals Freud's method of working. He developed many of his theories through self-analysis. In the late 1890s, after his father died, Freud began a systematic examination of his own unconscious mind. Every morning, he would analyze his dreams from the night before, exploring his own memories, desires, and conflicts. This intensive self-exploration lasted for several years and led to one of his most important works. In 1899, though it was dated 1900 to make it seem more momentous, Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams. He later said this was his most significant achievement, and in many ways, he was right. In this book, Freud argued that dreams are not random, they're not meaningless images that happen while we sleep. Instead, he believed dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, a direct pathway to understanding our hidden desires and fears. According to Freud, every dream has two levels of content. There's the manifest content, the actual story of the dream as you remember it, the strange narrative with its peculiar characters and impossible events. But beneath this lies the latent content, the true, hidden meaning, the unconscious wishes or fears that your mind is trying to express. The sleeping mind, Freud believed, works like a censor, disguising these unacceptable wishes in symbolic forms so they won't wake you up. That's why dreams are so often bizarre and illogical. They're compromises between your unconscious desires trying to express themselves and your internal censor trying to keep them hidden. Freud spent countless hours helping patients interpret their dreams, looking for symbols and patterns. He believed that through understanding our dreams, we could gain access to the unconscious conflicts causing our symptoms and suffering. A dream about losing your teeth might represent anxiety about aging or loss of power. A dream about flying might represent a wish for freedom or escape. A dream about being chased might reveal fears you haven't consciously acknowledged. Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine Freud, an elderly man now with his distinctive white beard, sitting in his study surrounded by books and ancient artifacts, a cigar resting in the ashtray, his dog sleeping at his feet, still listening, always listening, to the endless mysteries of the human mind, still trying to illuminate the darkness of the unconscious, bringing light to the hidden chambers of the soul. And as you drift towards sleep yourself, perhaps your own unconscious will speak to you tonight, in symbols and stories only you can fully understand. As you sink deeper into relaxation, let's explore how Freud understood the mind's ways of protecting itself, the invisible shields we all carry without even knowing. Freud observed something curious in his patients. When they came close to painful memories or unacceptable thoughts during therapy, they would suddenly change the subject, or forget what they were saying, or claim nothing more came to mind. He called this resistance, the unconscious mind's way of defending itself against threatening material. But resistance was just the beginning. Freud realized that we all use psychological strategies, operating completely outside our awareness, to protect ourselves from anxiety and emotional pain. He called these strategies defense mechanisms, and while Freud identified several, it was actually his daughter, Anna Freud, who later expanded and systematized the list. But let's focus on the one Sigmund himself emphasized. The most fundamental defense mechanism is repression, the process of pushing threatening thoughts, memories, or desires out of conscious awareness and burying them deep in the unconscious. It's not the same as consciously trying to forget something. Repression happens automatically, without you deciding to do it. A traumatic childhood memory might be completely repressed, gone from your conscious mind, yet still influencing your behavior and feelings in ways you don't understand. Another defense mechanism Freud identified is denial, simply refusing to acknowledge a painful reality. Someone who receives a devastating medical diagnosis might act as if they never heard it, continuing their life exactly as before. It's different from lying. The person genuinely can't accept the truth because it's too overwhelming. Then there's projection, when we take our own unacceptable feelings and attribute them to someone else instead. If you're angry but can't admit it to yourself, you might perceive everyone around you as angry. If you're attracted to someone inappropriately, you might convince yourself that they're attracted to you. Displacement is another fascinating mechanism, when we redirect our emotions from the real target to a safer one. You're furious at your boss, but you can't express it without losing your job, so you come home and snap at your family instead. The emotion finds an outlet, just not the right one. And then there's sublimation, which Freud considered the most mature defense mechanism, when we channel unacceptable impulses into socially acceptable activities. Aggressive urges might be sublimated into competitive sports. Sexual energy might be redirected into creative art or scientific discovery. Freud believed that much of human civilization itself was the result of sublimation, all our greatest achievements built from redirected primal drives. Now, let yourself drift back to Vienna once more, because Freud didn't work alone in developing these ideas. In the 1890s, he formed a deep friendship and professional partnership with a Berlin physician named Wilhelm Fliess. For several years, they exchanged hundreds of letters. Freud sharing his developing theories, seeking Fliess's approval and feedback. Freud was so emotionally invested in this friendship that some historians believe it had elements of what Freud himself would later call transference, the phenomenon where we unconsciously redirect feelings from important figures in our past onto people in our present. But friendships change, and in 1902, Freud's loneliness and isolation began to lift when he started gathering a small group of physicians and intellectuals for Wednesday evening meetings at his home. They would discuss his theories, debate psychological questions, and analyze case studies. This informal gathering became known as the Wednesday Psychological Society, and it was the seed from which the entire psychoanalytic movement would grow. Picture them in Freud's waiting room, cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling, voices rising in passionate argument, ideas sparking like electricity in the Viennese night. By 1908, this small group had grown and formalized into the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, and Freud's ideas were spreading beyond Austria. That same year, Freud received an invitation that would change everything, an invitation to come to America. Clark University in Massachusetts was celebrating its 20th anniversary, and its president, G. Stanley Hall, wanted Freud to deliver a series of lectures. Freud was initially reluctant. He didn't speak English well and had little regard for American culture, but the invitation came with an honorary doctorate, and the fee was generous. So in 1909, Freud made his only visit to the United States, accompanied by his colleague Carl Jung and another follower, Sandor Ferenczi. He delivered 5 lectures at Clark University, speaking in German, explaining his theories to an American audience for the first time. The lectures were a triumph. Freud was introduced to William James, the great American psychologist and philosopher, who was near the end of his life. The visit brought Freud international recognition. Psychoanalysis was no longer just a Viennese curiosity, it was becoming a global movement. But even as his influence grew, Freud remained deeply committed to his clinical work. He maintained a rigorous schedule, seeing patients for 50-minute sessions, which became known as the analytic hour, though it was actually 50 minutes, not 60. This wasn't arbitrary. Freud discovered that 50 minutes was the right length to maintain focus and intensity while allowing him brief breaks between sessions to collect his thoughts. He would see patients from early morning until evening, 6 days a week, taking only a brief break for lunch. What's remarkable is Freud's dedication to the therapeutic relationship itself. He believed that the relationship between analyst and patient wasn't just a setting for treatment, it was the treatment. Through what he called transference, patients would unconsciously project feelings about important people from their past, usually parents, onto the analyst. A patient might become angry at the analyst the way they were once angry at their father, or seek approval the way they once sought their mother's love. Rather than seeing this as a problem, Freud recognized it as an opportunity, a chance to observe and work through these old patterns in the safety of the therapeutic relationship. And there was countertransference too. Freud's term for the analyst's own emotional reactions to the patient. He believed analysts needed to be aware of their own unconscious responses, to analyze themselves continuously, so they wouldn't let their own issues interfere with the patient's treatment. This is why Freud insisted that anyone who wanted to become a psychoanalyst must first undergo their own thorough analysis. Let your mind rest now in the quiet of Freud's consulting room, the famous couch with its rich oriental rug draped over it. Freud sitting just out of sight behind the patient's head, listening with what he called evenly suspended attention, not trying to direct or judge, simply allowing the unconscious to reveal itself in its own time, in its own mysterious way. The shadows lengthen across the room, another session draws to a close, and the patient rises, perhaps understanding themselves a little better than they did an hour before, perhaps carrying questions that will unfold slowly over years of this careful, patient work. Breathe slowly, and let's journey deeper into Freud's world, to the relationships that shaped psychoanalysis, and sometimes fractured it. Among those Wednesday evening gatherings in Freud's waiting room, one man stood out. Carl Gustav Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist from Zurich. Jung was younger than Freud by nearly 20 years, brilliant and ambitious, and when they began corresponding in 1906, Freud saw in him something special, perhaps a son, perhaps an heir to carry psychoanalysis forward. Their letters grew warmer, more frequent, more intimate. Freud even began to call Jung his crown prince, the one who would lead the psychoanalytic movement after Freud was gone. In 1909, they traveled together to America for those lectures at Clark University, and on the long ocean voyage, they analyzed each other's dreams, testing and exploring their theories together. But something was already stirring beneath the surface, differences in how they understood the unconscious, differences in temperament and belief. Jung was becoming interested in spirituality, mythology, and what he saw as the collective patterns shared across all humanity. Freud remained firmly rooted in the individual, in sexuality and childhood experience as the foundation of the psyche. The break came in 1913. Painful and bitter for both men. Jung rejected Freud's emphasis on sexuality as the primary driving force of human psychology. He began developing his own theories, ideas about archetypes and the collective unconscious that Freud found mystical and unscientific. For Freud, this felt like betrayal, a deep personal wound. They never spoke again after their split, though both continued to develop their separate schools of thought. Jung would go on to found analytical psychology, while Freud continued refining psychoanalysis, but the pain of that broken relationship stayed with Freud for the rest of his life. Jung wasn't the only one to break away. Alfred Adler, another early member of that Wednesday evening circle, also parted ways with Freud around 1911. Adler believed that Freud focused too much on sexuality and the unconscious, and not enough on social factors and the conscious mind striving for superiority and significance. Adler developed what he called individual psychology, emphasizing how people compensate for feelings of inferiority and work toward goals. Freud saw this as another defection, another rejection of psychoanalytic truth. These splits were agonizing for Freud. He took them personally, but they also reveal something important. Freud didn't just want followers, he wanted true believers. He saw psychoanalysis almost like a movement or a cause that had to be protected from deviation and distortion. In 1912, he even formed a secret committee, a small group of his most loyal followers who would defend psychoanalytic theory and work to spread it faithfully. They each received a gold ring from Freud, a symbol of their commitment and inner circle status. It was both touching and a little cultish, showing how deeply Freud cared about preserving his life's work. Now let yourself float forward through time, to the year 1923. Freud was now in his late 60s, still working, still writing, when he noticed something troubling. There was a lesion in his mouth, on his palate and jaw. He had been a heavy cigar smoker his entire adult life, 20 cigars a day, sometimes more. And now he was paying the price. The diagnosis was cancer, oral cancer, and it would haunt him for the remaining 16 years of his life. Freud underwent the first of what would eventually be more than 30 surgeries to remove cancerous tissue and reconstruct his jaw and mouth. He had to wear a prosthetic device, an uncomfortable metal and rubber apparatus he called the monster, that separated his nasal cavity from his mouth and made speaking and eating difficult. Yet through all this suffering, all this pain, Freud continued to see patients and write. His dedication was extraordinary, almost superhuman. He refused most pain medication because he wanted to keep his mind clear for his work. It was during this period of illness and mortality that Freud's thinking took a darker turn. In 1920, he had published a book called Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and in it, he introduced a new and troubling concept. Until then, Freud had believed that human beings were primarily driven by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, what he called the pleasure principle. But now he proposed something else, something more sinister lurking in the depths of the unconscious. He called it the death drive, or sometimes thanatos, a fundamental instinct that works against life itself. Freud observed that people often seem to repeat painful patterns, to sabotage their own happiness, to be drawn toward destruction. He saw soldiers suffering from what we now call PTSD, reliving their traumas and nightmares. He saw people in his own life making the same mistakes over and over. And he began to wonder if there wasn't something in us that actually seeks dissolution, a desire to return to an earlier state of non-existence, a pull towards silence and stillness and the end of all tension. Opposite the death drive, he now placed eros, the life drive, encompassing not just sexuality but all creative, connecting, life-affirming impulses. Freud believed these two forces, eros and thanatos, love and death, were locked in an eternal struggle within every human being. Sometimes eros won, and we created, loved, built, and nurtured. Sometimes thanatos won, and we destroyed, whether outwardly through aggression or inwardly through self-sabotage and depression. This was a more pessimistic Freud than the one who had first begun exploring the unconscious decades earlier, a man confronting his own mortality, watching the world slide toward another catastrophic war, seeing the darkness humans were capable of. Yet he never stopped working. Even as his health deteriorated, even as the cancer returned again and again, he continued his practice, his writing, his endless exploration of the human psyche. Picture him now in his study, older, frailer, his face marked by surgery and suffering, the prosthetic device making every word an effort, surrounded by his collection of ancient figurines, his chow dog, Jofi, lying nearby, still listening to patients, still believing that through understanding the unconscious, through bringing the hidden into light, human suffering could be eased. The clock ticks softly on the wall, another hour passes, another session ends, and Freud prepares for the next patient, for the next dream to be interpreted, for the next fragment of unconscious truth to be discovered. Let that image settle in your mind, as your own breathing deepens, as you drift closer to the realm where your own unconscious waits to speak. Rest easy now, and let's turn to another dimension of Freud's thought, his understanding of anxiety, that uncomfortable companion we all know too well. Freud spent considerable time thinking about anxiety, that feeling of dread or unease that can grip us without clear reason. Early in his career, He believed anxiety was simply transformed sexual energy, libido that couldn't find proper expression and so converted itself into nervousness. But as his thinking matured, particularly in his 1926 work Inhibitions, Symptoms and Anxiety, he revised this view completely. Anxiety, he now believed, wasn't just a symptom, it was a signal, a warning from the ego that danger was approaching. He distinguished between different types of anxiety. There's realistic anxiety, the kind that makes perfect sense, fear of a real external threat, like an approaching storm or a dangerous animal. Then there's neurotic anxiety, fear that the ID's unacceptable impulses might break through and cause you to do something terrible or embarrassing. And finally, moral anxiety, the fear of your own superego, the dread of guilt and shame when you've violated your own internalized standards. Picture these three types as different alarm bells in the mind, each one alerting you to a different kind of danger, each one trying to protect you in its own way. Freud believed that neurotic symptoms, the compulsions, the phobias, the inexplicable physical pains, were actually compromises. The unconscious mind, faced with an unacceptable desire or memory, creates a symptom that both expresses and conceals the underlying conflict. A woman who unconsciously resents her demanding mother might develop paralysis in her arm, unable to care for her mother, yet not having to acknowledge her resentment. The symptom serves a purpose, it's a solution, albeit a costly one, to an internal conflict that seems otherwise unsolvable. Now, imagine Freud's Vienna in the early 20th century, a world of strict social codes, where sexuality was rarely discussed openly, where appearances meant everything. Many of Freud's patients were women, often young, intelligent, creative women trapped in narrow social roles. They came to him with mysterious symptoms, paralyses, blindnesses, seizures, that had no physical cause. The medical establishment often dismissed them as hysterics or malingerers. But Freud listened, and he believed them. One of his most famous case studies involved a young woman he called Dora, though her real name was Ida Bauer. In 1900, her father brought her to Freud because she was experiencing coughing fits, depression, and had even written a suicide note. Through their sessions, Freud uncovered a tangled web of family secrets and betrayals. Dora's father was having an affair with a family friend, Frau K., and her K had made unwanted advances toward Dora herself. The family wanted Dora to stay quiet about all of it, to preserve appearances. Her symptoms, Freud argued, were her psyche's way of protesting an impossible situation. Freud published the case as fragment of an analysis of a case of hysteria in 1905, though he later acknowledged he had made mistakes in treating Dora. She terminated therapy after just 3 months, and Freud came to believe he had failed to recognize soon enough how she was transferring feelings about the various adults who had failed her onto him. The case became controversial, some seeing it as brilliant detective work into the unconscious, others as Freud imposing his theories onto a young woman's genuine trauma. But it revealed something important about Freud's method, his willingness to engage with the messy complexity of real lives, to take women's suffering seriously in an era that often did not. Another influential case study was Little Hans, published in 1909 under the title Analysis of a Phobia in a 5-year-old Boy. Hans was actually Herbert Graf, the young son of one of Freud's followers. The boy had developed an intense fear of horses, afraid they would fall down or bite him. Freud didn't actually treat Hans directly. Instead, he supervised the boy's father, who conducted the analysis and reported back to Freud. Through the father's reports and correspondence, Freud interpreted Hans's phobia as a manifestation of the Oedipus complex. The horses, particularly the fear they would fall, symbolized Hans's unconscious wish that his father would fall or disappear, so Hans could have his mother to himself. The fear of being bitten represented anxiety about punishment for these forbidden wishes. When Hans's anxiety was gently explored and brought into the open through conversation, the phobia gradually dissolved. The case became one of Freud's primary pieces of evidence for childhood sexuality and the Oedipus complex, though it too has been debated and questioned by later scholars. Let yourself sink deeper now, as we consider perhaps Freud's most enigmatic case study, The Wolf Man, published in 1918. His real name was Sergei Pankejeff, a wealthy young Russian who came to Freud suffering from severe psychological disturbances. The case centered on a dream Pankejeff had experienced as a very young child, a nightmare of white wolves sitting in a tree outside his window, staring at him silently. This dream, Freud believed, was the key to understanding the man's entire psychological structure. Through painstaking analysis, Freud traced the dream back to what he believed was a primal scene, an occasion when the infant Sergei had witnessed his parents engaged in sexual intercourse. The image had been repressed, buried deep in the unconscious, but it continued to exert its influence, shaping Sergei's adult neuroses and anxieties. The white wolves in the tree were symbolic transformations of this traumatic memory. Whether this primal scene actually occurred or was a fantasy, whether Freud's interpretation was accurate or imposed, these questions have occupied psychoanalysts for over a century. But the case demonstrated Freud's commitment to detailed, long-term analysis. He worked with Pankejeff for several years, and his belief that early childhood experiences leave permanent marks on the psyche. These case studies, Dora, Little Hans, The Wolf Man, and others, became the foundation of psychoanalytic literature. They weren't just clinical reports, they read almost like detective stories or psychological novels, filled with mystery, interpretation, and revelation. Freud wrote beautifully. His German prose was clear and compelling, which partly explains why his ideas spread so widely beyond medical circles. In 1930, he even received the prestigious Goethe Prize for Literature, recognition that he was not just a scientist but an artist of language, a storyteller of the soul. Close your eyes and picture those case histories spread across a desk, pages and pages of notes, dreams recorded, memories explored, secrets revealed, each one a window into a unique human mind, yet all of them, Freud believed, governed by the same underlying principles, the same unconscious forces, the same ancient drives and conflicts that unite all humanity. The candle burns low in the study, the last patient has gone home, and Freud sits alone with his thoughts and his notes, assembling the puzzle pieces of the psyche, building his grand theory one case, one dream, one interpretation at a time. Let that peaceful image carry you deeper into rest, as your own unconscious begins to stir, preparing its own dreams and symbols for the night ahead. Settle into stillness, and let's explore how Freud looked beyond the individual mind, to culture, society, and civilization itself. Freud wasn't content to limit his theories to the therapist's office. He believed that psychoanalysis could illuminate not just individual neuroses, but the very structure of human society and culture. In 1913, he published a bold and controversial book called Totem and Taboo, in which he attempted to apply psychoanalytic principles to anthropology and the origins of civilization itself. Drawing on contemporary anthropological studies, though much of that research would later be questioned. Freud proposed a dramatic theory about the dawn of human society. He imagined a primal horde, a prehistoric group dominated by a powerful father figure who kept all the women for himself and drove away his sons. Eventually, Freud speculated, the sons banded together, killed the father, and devoured him in a totemic feast. But after the deed, they were overwhelmed by guilt and remorse. They had loved the father even as they hated him. From this original crime, Freud argued, came the first taboos, the first moral codes, the prohibition against murder and incest, and the foundations of religion and social organization. It was the Oedipus complex writ large, played out at the species level. This wasn't history in any literal sense. Even Freud acknowledged it was speculative, but he believed it captured a psychological truth about the ambivalence at the heart of civilization, our simultaneous need for authority and our resentment of it, our capacity for both love and violence toward the same figures. The book shocked many readers, but it showed Freud's ambition to create a comprehensive theory of human nature, not just individual psychology. Years later, in 1930, Freud published another major work on civilization called Civilization and Its Discontents. By now he was in his 70s, living with constant pain from his cancer, and his view of human nature had grown darker. In this book, he argued that civilization itself is built on repression and frustration. Society requires us to control our aggressive and sexual instincts, to channel them into productive work and acceptable behavior. But this control comes at a cost. It makes us perpetually dissatisfied, perpetually at odds with ourselves. Freud wrote that the price we pay for civilization is a heavy burden of neurotic unhappiness. We can't simply follow our desires. We must suppress them, redirect them, deny them. The superego becomes harsher and more punishing the more civilized we become, demanding greater and greater renunciation of instinctual satisfaction. And so we're caught in a tragic bind. We need civilization to survive and flourish, but civilization makes us miserable. There's no escape from this fundamental tension, no utopia where human nature and social requirements perfectly align. It was a profoundly pessimistic vision, yet one Freud believed was realistic and honest. Let your mind drift now to another of Freud's explorations beyond the clinic, his thoughts on religion. In 1927, he published The Future of an Illusion, a book that examined religious belief through a psychoanalytic lens. Freud argued that religion is a collective neurosis, a mass delusion born from humanity's helplessness in the face of nature's power and life's uncertainties. Just as a child feels powerless and looks to a protective father, humanity creates a divine father figure in heaven, an all-powerful being who will protect us, give meaning to our suffering, and promise us immortality. Freud was himself an atheist, raised Jewish but non-practicing, and he saw religious belief as wishful thinking, a refusal to accept reality as it is. Religion, he wrote, is an illusion, not necessarily a lie, but a belief derived from human wishes rather than evidence. He predicted that as humanity matured and science advanced, religion would gradually fade away, replaced by a more rational, scientific worldview. Of course, that prediction hasn't come true. Religion remains powerful worldwide, but Freud's analysis of the psychological roots of religious belief remains influential and provocative. Then in 1939, the final year of his life, Freud published his last major work, Moses and Monotheism. It was a strange, difficult book, written in 3 essays while Freud was elderly, ill, and living in exile. In it, he made an extraordinary claim that Moses, the great Hebrew lawgiver, was not actually Jewish at all, but an Egyptian, a follower of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who had briefly established monotheistic worship of the sun god Aten in Egypt. Freud theorized that after Akhenaten's death and the return to polytheism, Moses led a group of people out of Egypt, taking the monotheistic idea with him. Later, Freud speculated, the Israelites rebelled and killed Moses in the wilderness, another version of the primal father murder. The guilt from this murder, repressed for generations, eventually led to the development of Judaism as we know it, with its strict moral code and its God of conscience. It was vintage Freud, applying the Oedipus complex and the death of the primal father to religious history, searching for the unconscious guilt beneath cultural traditions. The book was deeply controversial. Many found it offensive or simply strange, but it revealed Freud's lifelong fascination with his own Jewish identity. Though he rejected religious practice, he never denied his Jewish heritage, and in the 1930s, as anti-Semitism grew more virulent in Europe, that heritage became increasingly dangerous. By 1933, the Nazis had come to power in Germany, and Freud's books were among those burned in public bonfires. Psychoanalysis was denounced as Jewish science, degenerate and corrupting. Freud watched from Vienna as the world darkened, as many of his colleagues fled, as patients stopped coming. He was famous enough, old enough, ill enough, that he thought perhaps he'd be left alone. But in 1938, after Nazi Germany annexed Austria and the Anschluss, the danger became immediate and undeniable. The Gestapo raided Freud's home and his daughter Anna was detained and questioned for a day, an experience that terrified the entire family. Freud's books and papers were confiscated. His colleagues and followers worked frantically behind the scenes, pulling strings, negotiating, trying to secure his safe passage out of Austria. Finally, after paying a huge ransom, essentially a tax for being Jewish and wanting to leave, and with the help of influential friends including Princess Marie Bonaparte of France and the American diplomat William Bullitt, the Freud family was allowed to leave. In June 1938, at age 82, suffering from advanced cancer, Freud left Vienna, the city that had been his home for nearly 80 years. He traveled by train to Paris, and then across the Channel to London, to safety, to exile. He brought with him his immediate family, his collection of antiquities, and what remained of his library. 4 of his elderly sisters were left behind. They lacked the resources or connections to escape, and all 4 would eventually perish in Nazi concentration camps, a grief Freud was spared by his own death before he learned their fate. In London, Freud settled into a house at 20, Maresfield Gardens in Hampstead, a pleasant neighborhood far from the Vienna he had known. The house was arranged to recreate his Viennese study as much as possible, his desk, his couch, his precious collection of ancient figurines all in their familiar places. He continued to see a few patients, continued to write, even as his strength faded. Visitors came from around the world to pay their respects to the aging founder of psychoanalysis, including the writer H. G. Wells and the artist Salvador Dali. Let yourself rest in that image, the elderly Freud in his London study, transplanted, in exile, surrounded by the artifacts he'd collected over a lifetime. Egyptian gods and Greek heroes keeping watch, the couch where so many had lain and spoken their dreams, now in a foreign country, under a different sky, but still serving the same purpose, still a place where the unconscious could speak. The afternoon light slants through the windows, touches the ancient stone faces, and Freud sits quietly, conserving his strength, knowing his time is growing short, but still present, still listening, still devoted to the work that had consumed his life. Breathe deeply, and let's explore some of the quieter details of Freud's life, the personal habits and relationships that shaped the man behind the theories. Throughout his adult life, Freud maintained a remarkably disciplined daily routine. He would rise early, see his first patient at 8 in the morning, and then continue through a full schedule of sessions until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. After lunch with his family, he would take a walk, always a walk, through the streets of Vienna. These daily constitutionals were sacrosanct, a time to think, to process, to let his mind wander. He would often be accompanied by his daughter Anna, or sometimes by one of his dogs, and he used this time to organize his thoughts before returning to his desk. After his walk, Freud would spend the late afternoon and evening seeing more patients, 5 or 6 more analytic hours, and then finally, after dinner, he would retreat to his study to write. This is when his major works were composed, late at night, in the quiet hours when the household slept. He wrote by hand, page after page in his precise script, working on his theoretical papers, his case studies, his letters to colleagues around the world. It was a grueling schedule, 12 to 14-hour workdays were common, yet he maintained this pace for decades. Freud's marriage was another constant in his life. In 1886, after a long engagement, he married Martha Bernays, a woman from a respectable Jewish family. Their courtship had lasted 4 years, much of it conducted through letters, as they lived in different cities. Freud's letters to Martha during this period reveal a passionate, jealous, possessive young man, very different from the measured, analytical physician he would later become. He demanded her complete devotion, wanted her to break ties with friends and family members he disapproved of, revealed an intensity of feeling he would later learn to channel into his work. Martha and Sigmund had 6 children together, 3 sons and 3 daughters, born between 1887 and 1895. Martha managed the household, raised the children, created a stable domestic environment that allowed Freud to focus entirely on his work. But by most accounts, the marriage became less passionate over time, more companionate, more practical. Some biographers have suggested that Freud sublimated his own sexual energy into his work, that the intensity he once directed toward Martha found new expression in his theories about libido and desire. Martha outlived Sigmund by many years, dying in 1951 at age 90, having been married to him for 53 years. Of their 6 children, it was the youngest, Anna, born in 1895, who became closest to her father and followed most directly in his footsteps. Anna Freud became a pioneering psychoanalyst in her own right, specializing in child psychology and developing techniques for analyzing children. She never married, devoted her life to psychoanalysis and to caring for her aging father in his final years. The relationship between Sigmund and Anna was deep and complex. She underwent analysis with her own father, which would be considered deeply problematic by today's ethical standards, but it speaks to how enmeshed psychoanalysis and family life had become in the Freud household. Now let your mind drift to another presence in Freud's life, his dogs. In his later years, Freud developed a deep attachment to his chow chows, a breed he admired for their dignity and independence. His most beloved dog was named Jofi, a reddish chow who would lie quietly in his consulting room during analytic sessions. Freud believed that Jofi could sense his patient's emotional states, that the dog would move closer to calm patients and stay distant from agitated ones. He even used Jofi as a kind of timer. The dog would apparently become restless when the 50-minute hour was nearly complete, signaling that it was time to conclude. Freud wrote that he found dogs' affection simpler and more genuine than human relationships, free from the ambivalence that characterized human love. After Jofi died, Freud was deeply grieved, writing to a friend that he had never experienced such intense mourning for a human being. It was a touching admission from a man who had spent his life analyzing human emotions, that perhaps the uncomplicated love of a dog touched something in him that human complexity could not. Let's turn now to Freud's famous collection, the hundreds of ancient artifacts that filled his study and lined his shelves. He began collecting in earnest in the 1890s, acquiring pieces from Egypt, Greece, Rome, China, and other ancient civilizations. These weren't mere decorations, they were objects of deep fascination for him. He saw in these ancient cultures, their myths, their gods, their rituals, reflections of the same unconscious patterns he was discovering in his patients. Freud would often touch these figures while thinking, hold them in his hands during difficult moments, arrange and rearrange them on his desk. He compared the work of psychoanalysis to archaeology. Both involved excavating hidden layers, bringing buried things to light, reconstructing vanished worlds from fragments and traces. The archaeologist digs through earth to find ancient civilizations. The psychoanalyst digs through layers of repression and forgetting to find the buried past within the psyche. His collection was both metaphor and inspiration, a constant reminder that the past is never truly gone. It lives on, in ruins, in memory, in the unconscious depths of the mind. By 1923, when his cancer was diagnosed, Freud faced not just physical pain but the real possibility that he would not be able to continue speaking, the very foundation of his therapeutic method. The surgeries on his jaw and palate were extensive, removing tissue, restructuring bone, leaving him with that uncomfortable prosthetic device that made eating difficult and speaking painful. Yet remarkably, Freud's intellect remained sharp, his productivity continued, even as his body failed him. He was fitted with more than 30 different prosthetic devices over the years, each one an attempt to improve function and comfort, none entirely successful. The prosthesis had to be removed and cleaned regularly, a painful, undignified process. It affected his speech, gave him a slightly muffled quality, but he persisted. He continued to see patients right up until the final months of his life, continued to engage in the talking cure even when talking itself had become an ordeal. It was a testament to his extraordinary dedication, his belief in the power of words to heal, his refusal to surrender to the disease that was slowly claiming him. Through all this suffering, Freud maintained his stoicism. He refused most pain medications, concerned they would dull his mind, and he faced his mortality with clear eyes. He had spent his career thinking about death, about the death drive, about how we defend against the knowledge of our own impermanence. Now he was living what he had theorized, confronting the ultimate reality that no defense mechanism can forever keep at bay. Picture him in those final years, still in his study each day, still surrounded by his ancient companions, still listening to the stories his patients brought him, still believing that understanding could ease suffering, that bringing the unconscious into consciousness could free people from their invisible chains, even as his own body became a prison he could not escape. The light grows softer in the room, shadows deepen in the corners, and the ancient faces gaze down silently, witnesses to one man's lifetime of listening, of thinking, of trying to map the unmappable terrain of the human soul. Let that quiet dedication settle over you like a blanket, as you sink deeper into rest, your own day's work complete, your own mind preparing to journey into the unconscious realm where Freud spent his life exploring. Rest peacefully now, and let's explore some of Freud's ideas that reached beyond the consulting room, into art, literature, and the creative imagination. Freud was deeply interested in creativity, in where artistic inspiration comes from, in what drives someone to create. In 1908, he published an essay called Creative Writers and Daydreaming, in which he proposed that artistic creation is related to childhood play and to the fantasies we weave in our minds. Just as children create imaginary worlds to fulfill their wishes, adults do the same through daydreams, and artists, Freud suggested, are those who can transform their private fantasies into works that speak to others. The artist finds a way to disguise personal wishes and conflicts in forms that give pleasure to an audience, and in doing so, experiences a kind of release, a catharsis that makes the unconscious pressures more bearable. He believed that great art works precisely because it taps into universal unconscious themes, the same conflicts and desires we all share but usually keep hidden. When we respond powerfully to a painting, a novel, a piece of music, we're recognizing something of our own unconscious reflected back to us, something expressed more eloquently than we could express it ourselves. art becomes a socially acceptable form of wish fulfillment, both for the artist and for the audience. Freud applied this thinking to specific works of art and literature throughout his career. In 1910, he wrote a lengthy study of Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci and a memory of his childhood, in which he attempted a psychoanalytic biography of the great Renaissance artist. Freud focused on a childhood memory Leonardo had recorded, a memory of a vulture coming to his cradle and striking his lips with its tail. From this single image, Freud constructed an elaborate interpretation, suggesting that Leonardo's genius was connected to his illegitimacy, his relationship with his mother, and sublimated homosexual feelings. Modern scholars have found many flaws in Freud's Leonardo study, including the fact that the bird in question was probably a kite, not a vulture, due to a mistranslation, but the essay remains fascinating as an example of Freud's method applied to historical figures. He was trying to show that even the greatest creative achievements have roots in unconscious conflicts, that genius itself can be understood psychoanalytically. It was bold, perhaps too bold, but it demonstrated Freud's conviction that psychoanalysis could illuminate all aspects of human experience. Literature held a special place in Freud's heart. He was widely read, knew the classics, could quote Goethe and Shakespeare from memory. He often said that the great poets and writers had intuited the truths of the unconscious long before psychoanalysis gave them scientific form. He saw himself as putting into systematic theory what artists had always known through insight and imagination. Throughout his writings, Freud drew on literary examples. Oedipus Rex, Hamlet, the Odyssey, using these stories to illustrate psychological principles. In 1919, Freud published an essay called The Uncanny, in German, Das Unheimliche, exploring why certain things fill us with a peculiar kind of dread. He drew on a short story by E.T.A. Hoffmann called The Sandman, about a man tormented by childhood fears and a sinister figure who seems both real and imagined. Freud argued that the uncanny feeling arises when something that should remain hidden, something repressed, suddenly resurfaces. It's the shock of recognizing something deeply familiar that we thought we'd forgotten, like seeing a doll or automaton that seems almost alive, or experiencing déjà vu, or encountering a double of yourself. These experiences unsettle us because they blur the boundary between inner and outer reality, between the dead and the living, between past and present. The essay on the uncanny revealed Freud's sensitivity to the aesthetic dimensions of psychological experience, his understanding that certain feelings can't be reduced to simple explanations but must be approached through metaphor and mood. It's one of his most literary works, and it has influenced countless artists, filmmakers, and writers who work with themes of horror and the supernatural. Now let your thoughts drift to another of Freud's enduring contributions, his influence on our everyday language. So many terms we use casually today come directly from Freud. When we talk about someone being in denial, or having a Freudian slip, or being anal retentive, we're using concepts he introduced. The very idea that we have an ego, that we might be repressing something, that we're driven by a libido, these have all entered common speech. Even people who have never read a word of Freud, who might reject his theories entirely, still think in fundamentally Freudian ways. The assumption that childhood experiences shape adult personality, that dreams have meaning, that we're not fully aware of our own motivations, that talking about problems can help resolve them, all of these ideas, now so common they seem obvious, were radical when Freud first proposed them. He changed not just psychology but the entire cultural conversation about what it means to be human. Freud also influenced how we think about sexuality. Before Freud, sexuality was largely a taboo topic, something not discussed in polite society, certainly not something to be analyzed or understood psychologically. Freud insisted that sexuality was central to human psychology, that it couldn't be ignored or wished away. His concept of libido as a fundamental life energy, his theories about psychosexual development, his openness in discussing sexual matters, all of this helped pave the way for more honest conversations about human sexuality. Of course, many of his specific claims have been challenged or rejected. The idea that all neuroses stem from sexual repression, that women experience penis envy, that homosexuality is a form of developmental arrest. Modern psychology has moved far beyond these notions. But Freud's insistence that sexuality matters, that it's intertwined with identity, creativity, and psychological health, that it deserves serious study rather than moralistic judgment, these contributions remain significant. In his final years in London, even as his body weakened, Freud's mind remained engaged with large questions. He had spent a lifetime studying the individual psyche, but he never lost sight of the broader human condition. He had lived through World War I, seen the rise of fascism, witnessed unspeakable cruelty and irrationality. His later works reflected a man grappling with the darkness of human nature, the capacity for destruction that civilization could barely contain. He had no easy answers, no comforting illusions to offer. But he believed in the value of understanding, in facing reality as it is rather than as we wish it to be. By the summer of 1939, Freud's cancer had progressed beyond any hope of treatment. The pain was constant, severe. He could barely eat or sleep. His doctor, Max Schur, had promised years earlier that when the time came, when life became nothing but suffering, he would help Freud end it with dignity. On September 21, 1939, Freud reminded Schur of that promise. He said simply, "Talk it over with Anna, and if she thinks it's right, then make an end of it." Anna, devoted daughter, reluctant but understanding, agreed. On September 23, 1939, Dr. Schur administered morphine, enough to ease Freud into unconsciousness, and then, hours later, another dose. Sigmund Freud died peacefully that day, at the age of 83, in his home in Hampstead, surrounded by his family and his beloved collection of ancient artifacts, the objects that had kept him company through decades of listening and thinking and writing. 3 days later, his body was cremated at Golders Green Crematorium in London. A simple ceremony, attended by family and close colleagues, including Ernest Jones, his devoted biographer, and Stefan Zweig, the Austrian writer. Freud's ashes were placed in a Greek urn, one from his own collection, a red-figured amphora from ancient Athens. Even in death, he remained surrounded by the ancient world he had loved, the civilizations that had both inspired his thinking and provided him comfort. Let that image rest in your mind, the Greek urn holding his ashes, ancient clay containing what remained of a modern mind, a mind that had journeyed so far into the hidden depths of human consciousness, that had mapped territories no one had named before, that had given us new language for understanding ourselves. The study at Maresfield Gardens stands quiet now, preserved exactly as he left it, a museum where visitors can still see his couch, his desk, his collection, can stand where patients once lay and spoke their dreams, can imagine the countless hours of listening that took place in that room, the healing and the understanding that happened there. And as you drift towards sleep yourself, perhaps you carry something of Freud with you, some awareness of the depths within, some curiosity about your own unconscious, some appreciation for the mystery and complexity of the human mind. Let yourself relax completely, and let's explore Freud's lasting influence, how his ideas spread across the world, and how they continue to shape our understanding today. After Freud's death, psychoanalysis didn't end, it evolved and branched into many directions. His daughter Anna Freud became one of the most important figures in carrying his legacy forward. She focused her work on child psychology and development, writing extensively about defense mechanisms in children, establishing the Hampstead Child Therapy Course and Clinic in London in 1947. Anna expanded on her father's theories about defense mechanisms, cataloging them more systematically, showing how children use different defenses at different developmental stages. She became a pioneer in her own right, proving that psychoanalysis could be adapted to work with children, even though her father had rarely worked directly with young patients. Meanwhile, the house at 20, Maresfield Gardens, where Freud spent his final year, was preserved by Anna after his death. She continued to live there and work there for decades, maintaining her father's study exactly as he had left it. After Anna's death in 1982, the house was transformed into the Freud Museum, opened to the public in 1986. Today, visitors from around the world can walk through those rooms, can see the famous couch with its Persian rug, can view the collection of antiquities arranged on the desk and shelves, can stand in the space where psychoanalysis took its final form. It's a pilgrimage site for those interested in the history of psychology, a preserved moment in time, a sanctuary of ideas. Across the Atlantic, psychoanalysis found particularly fertile ground in the United States. After Freud's 1909 visit to Clark University, American interest in his theories grew steadily. By the 1940s and 1950s, psychoanalysis had become deeply influential in American psychiatry and culture. Major cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago became centers of psychoanalytic training and practice. The golden age of psychoanalysis in America saw Freudian concepts entering not just medicine but literature, film, and popular culture. Hollywood, in particular, embraced psychoanalytic themes. Films from the 1940s through the 1960s frequently featured psychiatrists as characters, explored themes of repression and unconscious desire, used dream sequences and symbolic imagery drawn from Freudian theory. Alfred Hitchcock's films, particularly Spellbound from 1945, which featured a dream sequence designed by Salvador Dali, and Psycho from 1960, drew heavily on psychoanalytic concepts of the unconscious, trauma, and split personality. The image of the analyst's couch, the probing questions, the revelation of hidden traumas, these became cultural touchstones, recognizable even to people who had never been in therapy. In the 1950s and 1960s, it became fashionable in certain circles, particularly among intellectuals and artists in cities like New York, to be in analysis. Years-long therapeutic relationships were common, 4 or 5 sessions per week, the classic psychoanalytic setup Freud had pioneered. To be in analysis was seen as a sign of sophistication, of self-awareness, of taking one's inner life seriously. Psychoanalysts wielded considerable cultural authority. Their interpretations of human behavior influenced how people understood themselves and their relationships. But even as psychoanalysis reached its peak of influence, challenges were emerging. In the 1950s and 1960s, new therapeutic approaches began to develop: behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy, humanistic psychology, each offering different ways of understanding and treating psychological problems. These approaches often required less time and seemed to produce faster results than traditional psychoanalysis. They focused more on current symptoms and behaviors rather than excavating childhood memories and unconscious conflicts. Then, beginning in the 1980s, the development of psychiatric medications, antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, mood stabilizers, offered yet another alternative. If depression or anxiety could be treated with a pill, why spend years lying on a couch talking about your childhood? The biological understanding of mental illness gained ground. The idea that psychological problems might be primarily chemical imbalances in the brain rather than unresolved unconscious conflicts. Insurance companies, too, began favoring shorter-term treatments that were less expensive than open-ended psychoanalysis. By the late 20th century, classical Freudian psychoanalysis had declined significantly in mainstream psychiatry and clinical psychology. Medical schools that once taught Freudian theory extensively reduced it to brief historical mentions. Research psychologists pointed out that many of Freud's core concepts, the Oedipus complex, penis envy, the specific psychosexual stages, lacked empirical support. Critics argued that Freud's theories were unfalsifiable, constructed in ways that made them impossible to prove or disprove scientifically. If a patient agreed with an interpretation, that confirmed it. If they disagreed, that was just resistance. Either way, the analyst was right. Yet despite these challenges, despite the decline of classical psychoanalysis as a dominant force in clinical practice, Freud's influence persists in surprising ways. Modern psychodynamic therapy, a descendant of psychoanalysis, remains widely practiced and has accumulated research support for its effectiveness with certain conditions. This approach retains core psychoanalytic ideas, the importance of unconscious processes, the influence of past relationships on present ones, the therapeutic value of the relationship between therapist and patient, but adapts them with shorter-term treatments and integration with other therapeutic methods. Beyond clinical practice, Freud's impact on the humanities has been profound and lasting. In literary criticism, psychoanalytic approaches continue to offer rich tools for interpreting texts, for understanding character motivation, for analyzing symbolism and unconscious themes in literature. Film studies draws heavily on psychoanalytic concepts, the male gaze, the uncanny, desire and identification in cinema. Philosophy, particularly continental philosophy, has engaged deeply with Freudian ideas. Thinkers like Jacques Lacan reinterpreted Freud through the lens of linguistics and structuralism, creating new schools of psychoanalytic thought. Feminist theory has had a complex relationship with Freud, critiquing his ideas about female sexuality and development as patriarchal and limited, yet also finding in psychoanalysis valuable tools for understanding how gender identity is formed, how patriarchal culture is internalized, how resistance and agency emerge. Thinkers like Juliet Mitchell and Julia Kristeva have worked to rescue and reformulate psychoanalytic insights while rejecting Freud's more problematic claims about women. In art and literature, Freud's influence is everywhere. Surrealism, that movement of the 1920s and 30s led by André Breton, explicitly drew on Freudian theories about the unconscious and dreams. Artists like Salvador Dali, René Magritte, and Max Ernst created works that seemed to emerge directly from the unconscious, bizarre juxtapositions, dream logic made visual, the manifest and latent content of dreams rendered on canvas. Breton called surrealism psychic automatism, a way of creating that bypassed conscious control and rational thought, allowing the unconscious to speak directly. Writers, too, absorbed Freudian ideas into their work. James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Franz Kafka, all wrote in the early 20th century when psychoanalysis was revolutionizing how people thought about consciousness. Their experiments with stream of consciousness narration, their exploration of interior psychological states, their interest in dreams, memory, and the irrational, all reflect a world transformed by Freudian insights. Even writers who never mentioned Freud explicitly were working in a cultural atmosphere he had helped create, where the unconscious was real, where hidden desires mattered, where the surface of consciousness concealed depths worth exploring. Think of it this way. Freud opened a door. He showed that beneath our rational, conscious minds lies another realm, a realm of wishes, fears, memories, and conflicts that shape our behavior in ways we don't fully recognize. Whether or not all his specific theories were correct, whether or not the Oedipus complex is universal, whether or not dreams really disguise wish fulfillment, the fundamental insight remains valuable. We are not entirely transparent to ourselves. We contain multitudes. Understanding ourselves requires patience, curiosity, and a willingness to look beneath the surface. Picture now all the therapists' offices around the world, not arranged exactly like Freud's study, perhaps, but still spaces dedicated to listening, to helping people understand themselves more deeply, to bringing unconscious patterns into awareness. Picture all the people lying awake at night, thinking about their childhoods, their relationships, their dreams, trying to make sense of who they are and why they do what they do. Picture all the artists and writers creating works that explore the hidden dimensions of human experience. In all of these, you can trace a line back to Vienna, back to that study filled with ancient artifacts, back to a doctor who listened to his patients and dared to theorize about the invisible architecture of the mind. As you rest now, let your own mind wander freely, following its own associations, drifting between conscious and unconscious, between waking thoughts and approaching dreams, knowing that within you, too, are depths yet to be explored, stories yet to be understood, a rich inner world waiting to reveal itself. Settle into comfort now, as we explore the final threads of Freud's remarkable story, and consider what his legacy means for us today. One fascinating aspect of Freud's work that deserves attention is his relationship with cocaine. In the 1880s, when Freud was a young physician just starting his career, cocaine was a newly isolated substance, and its properties were not yet fully understood. Between 1884 and 1887, Freud experimented extensively with cocaine, taking it himself and prescribing it to patients, friends, and family members. He believed he had discovered a wonder drug, a substance that could treat depression, digestive problems, and morphine addiction. He even wrote a paper called Über Coca, singing the praises of this remarkable compound. Freud gave cocaine to his close friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, a physiologist who had become addicted to morphine after a painful injury. Freud hoped the cocaine would cure the morphine addiction, but instead, Fleischl-Marxow became severely addicted to cocaine as well, suffering terrible psychological effects before his early death in 1891. This tragic outcome deeply affected Freud, filling him with guilt and sobering him about the dangers of the substance he had promoted so enthusiastically. He quietly distanced himself from his earlier advocacy for cocaine, though he apparently continued using small amounts himself for several more years. It was an early lesson in the complexity of the human mind and body, a reminder that simple chemical solutions to psychological problems were rarely as straightforward as they seemed. Another important element of Freud's thought was his concept of narcissism. In 1914, he published a paper called On Narcissism, an introduction, exploring self-love and its role in psychological development. Freud distinguished between primary narcissism, the infant's natural self-absorption before they even recognize others as separate beings, and secondary narcissism, when libido that was once directed toward others is withdrawn back to the self. He saw narcissism not just as vanity or selfishness, but as a fundamental aspect of how the ego develops and how we regulate our sense of self-worth. Freud believed that a certain amount of narcissism was healthy and necessary. We need to love ourselves to function, to maintain self-esteem, to protect ourselves psychologically. But excessive narcissism, when someone cannot truly recognize or empathize with others, when all relationships become merely mirrors for the self, this created serious psychological problems. The concept of narcissism has proven remarkably durable. Narcissistic personality disorder is recognized in modern psychiatric diagnosis, and the term narcissist has entered everyday language to describe self-absorbed individuals. Freud gave us a framework for understanding the delicate balance between healthy self-regard and pathological self-obsession. Let your breathing slow as we consider Freud's ideas about groups and society. In 1921, he published Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, examining how individuals behave differently when part of a crowd or group. Freud was trying to understand phenomena like mob violence, military cohesion, religious fervor, why people in groups often abandon their individual judgment and moral standards. He proposed that group members form emotional bonds by identifying with a leader and with each other, creating a shared ego ideal. The leader becomes a kind of father figure, and group members relate to each other as siblings in a symbolic family. This helps explain both the positive aspects of group belonging, the solidarity, the shared purpose, the willingness to sacrifice for others, and the dangerous aspects, the susceptibility to manipulation, the suppression of individual conscience, the capacity for collective violence. Freud was writing in the aftermath of World War I, trying to make sense of how civilized nations had descended into brutal, mechanized slaughter. His analysis of group psychology offered insights into nationalism, militarism, and the psychological foundations of both community and conformity. A few years later, in 1923, Freud published The Ego and the ID, a work that refined and systematized his model of the psyche. This was where he most clearly laid out the structural model, the ID, ego, and superego as three agencies in dynamic conflict. But he also explored how the ego itself is partly unconscious, how much of its defensive work happens outside awareness. The ego, caught between the demands of reality, the pressures of the ID, and the judgments of the superego, must constantly negotiate and compromise. Freud compared the ego to a rider on a horse, the horse being the ID with all its power and instinct, the rider trying to guide and control but not always succeeding. This book also developed his ideas about identification and how the superego forms. The superego, Freud argued, develops through identification with parents and other authority figures. We internalize their voices, their standards, their judgments. The superego can be harsh and punishing, more severe than the actual parents ever were, because it represents an idealized version of parental authority. This internal critic is partly why we feel guilt even when no one is watching, why we can be our own harshest judges. Understanding the superego helps explain moral anxiety and the sometimes irrational severity of our own self-criticism. Freud's influence extended into anthropology and the social sciences in complex ways. His work inspired researchers to think about how child-rearing practices and family structures in different cultures might shape personality in social organization. Anthropologists like Bronislaw Malinowski traveled to distant cultures, like the Trobriand Islands in the Pacific, to test Freudian theories. Malinowski found that the Oedipus complex didn't manifest in the same way in matrilineal societies where the mother's brother, not the father, was the primary authority figure. This suggested that some of Freud's theories were more culturally specific than universal, shaped by the particular family structure of early 20th century Vienna rather than reflecting timeless human nature. These anthropological challenges to Freud were important. They showed the limits of universalizing from one cultural context, but they also demonstrated the generative power of Freudian ideas. Even when researchers found evidence that contradicted specific Freudian claims, they were still asking Freudian questions, still thinking about how early relationships shape personality, how sexual and aggressive impulses are managed in different societies, how culture and psyche interact. Freud had set an agenda for inquiry that extended far beyond his own answers. Another of Freud's late works deserves mention, his 1924 essay The Dissolution of the Oedipus Complex, where he tried to explain how children successfully move beyond the Oedipal stage. He argued that for boys, the resolution comes through castration anxiety, the fear that the father will punish the boy's desires toward the mother. This fear is so overwhelming that the boy represses his Oedipal wishes, identifies with the father instead, and internalizes parental authority as the superego. For girls, Freud proposed a different and less confident account involving penis envy and eventual identification with the mother. His thinking about female psychology remained his weakest area. He himself admitted he found femininity a dark continent, and later psychoanalysts, including many women, have substantially revised or rejected his theories about female development. Now, as we near the end of our journey through Freudian psychology, consider this. Freud's greatest legacy may not be any single theory or concept, but rather a particular attitude toward human nature. An attitude of curiosity rather than judgment. A belief that symptoms and behaviors that seem irrational often make sense when you understand the full context, including the unconscious context. A conviction that listening matters, that being heard and understood has therapeutic value in itself. A recognition that we are all conflicted creatures, pulled in different directions by competing desires and demands, and that this conflict is not a flaw but simply the human condition. Freud taught us to ask why in new ways. Not just why do people do what they do, but why do they want what they want? Why do they feel what they feel? And why might they not fully know or acknowledge their own wants and feelings? These questions have become so fundamental to how we think about ourselves that we can barely imagine a time when they weren't asked. Before Freud, a cigar was sometimes just a cigar, but after Freud, we learned to wonder what else it might be, what it might symbolize, what unconscious meanings might lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary objects and actions. Think of Freud now in his final resting place, his ashes in that ancient Greek urn, kept at the Freud Museum alongside the couch where so many patients unburden themselves. The museum preserves not just objects but an approach to understanding, a way of seeing beneath surfaces, of taking seriously the irrational and the symbolic, of recognizing that human beings are deeper and stranger than we usually admit. In therapy rooms around the world, in university classrooms, in books and films and conversations, Freud's questions continue to echo. Who am I really? Why do I keep repeating the same patterns? What am I not allowing myself to know? What would happen if I looked more honestly at my desires and fears? These are Freudian questions, invitations to self-exploration, suggestions that the examined life requires examining not just our conscious thoughts but the vast unconscious realm beneath. As you drift now towards sleep, let yourself appreciate the mystery of your own mind. You contain memories you've forgotten, desires you haven't acknowledged, fears you've pushed away, conflicts you're still negotiating. Your dreams tonight will speak in the language of symbols and condensation, weaving together fragments of your day with deeper concerns, manifesting the latent in the manifest. And tomorrow, when you wake, you'll carry forward both what you remember and what you've forgotten, both your conscious intentions and your unconscious influences, the whole complex architecture of your psyche working together to create the experience of being you. Freud gave us permission to be curious about all of this, to explore without shame, to seek understanding rather than just control. He invited us to be archaeologists of our own depths, to dig gently through the layers, to bring hidden things to light, knowing that sometimes simply seeing and naming what was hidden can begin to change it. Rest now in that knowledge, that you are a mystery even to yourself, and that this mystery is not a problem to be solved but a depth to be honored, a richness to be explored, a gift that makes life infinitely more interesting than it would be if we were simply the conscious, rational beings we sometimes imagine ourselves to be. Let Freud's legacy cradle you as you sleep, his belief in the power of understanding, his respect for the complexity of human nature, his conviction that beneath the surface, always, there is more. Breathe deeply and let yourself sink even deeper into rest, as we explore a few more dimensions of Freud's fascinating life and work, details that reveal the richness of his thinking and his world. One relationship that deserves special attention is Freud's connection with his colleague and patient, Horace Frank. In the early 1920s, Frank was a prominent American psychoanalyst who came to Freud for analysis. Frank was married but had fallen in love with a wealthy patient named Angelica Bijur, who was also married. In a controversial decision, Freud encouraged Frank to divorce his wife and marry Bijur, partly, it seems, because Freud hoped that Bijur's wealth would support the psychoanalytic movement in America. Both couples divorced, and Frank and Bijur married, but the outcome was tragic. Frank suffered a severe mental breakdown, was hospitalized, and the marriage fell apart. This episode revealed a troubling side of Freud's influence, his willingness to interfere directly in patients' lives, his sometimes questionable boundaries between therapy and personal manipulation. It remains one of the more ethically problematic moments in Freud's career. Let your mind drift now to another aspect of Freud's thinking, his concept of repetition compulsion. He noticed something puzzling in his patients. They didn't just remember traumatic experiences, they seemed compelled to repeat them. A woman who had been abandoned by her father might repeatedly choose partners who would abandon her. A man traumatized in childhood might find himself in similar traumatic situations as an adult. This pattern seemed to contradict the pleasure principle. Why would anyone repeat painful experiences? Freud explored this idea most fully in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, suggesting that repetition compulsion might be related to the death drive, an attempt to master trauma by repeating it, or perhaps evidence of something even more fundamental pulling us toward dissolution and return to an earlier state. The concept has proven valuable in understanding why people sometimes seem to sabotage themselves, why patterns persist even when they cause suffering, why insight alone doesn't always lead to change. Modern trauma therapy draws on this understanding, recognizing that traumatic patterns can be deeply ingrained and require more than conscious awareness to shift. Freud's views on homosexuality were complex and, for his time, relatively progressive, though they remain problematic by today's standards. He did not believe that homosexuality was a mental illness or moral failing requiring treatment. In a famous 1935 letter to an American mother who had written to him worried about her homosexual son, Freud wrote that homosexuality was nothing to be ashamed of, no vice, no degradation, it cannot be classified as an illness. This was a remarkably tolerant position for the 1930s when homosexuality was widely pathologized and criminalized. However, Freud did view homosexuality as a form of arrested development, a stopping point on the path to heterosexual maturity that he considered the developmental goal. He theorized that it resulted from certain family dynamics, particularly a dominant mother and absent father. While his refusal to condemn homosexuality was ahead of his time, his developmental framework still positioned it as less than ideal, a compromise formation rather than simply another expression of human sexuality. Later psychoanalysts would reject this framework entirely, recognizing diverse sexualities as natural variations rather than developmental detours. Now let yourself relax even more deeply, as we consider Freud's thoughts on humor and jokes. In 1905, the same remarkably productive year he published 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. He also published Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious. In this often overlooked work, Freud analyzed why we find things funny, what makes a joke work, and what this reveals about the unconscious mind. Freud argued that jokes, like dreams, allow forbidden thoughts and feelings to emerge in disguised form. Through wordplay, double meanings, and sudden shifts in perspective, jokes let us express aggressive or sexual content that would be unacceptable if stated directly. When we laugh at a joke, we're experiencing pleasure from the release of psychic energy that's normally spent on repression and inhibition. Humor becomes a sophisticated defense mechanism, a way to acknowledge difficult realities while making them bearable. A joke about death, for instance, lets us confront mortality while deflecting its full weight through laughter. Freud himself appreciated humor, enjoyed puns and clever wordplay, and saw in comedy a window into how the mind manages uncomfortable truths. Another crucial concept in Freud's later work was what he called working through. He observed that simply having an insight, suddenly understanding why you feel or behave a certain way, rarely produces immediate change. A patient might intellectually grasp that their current relationship problems stem from childhood experiences with a critical parent, but that understanding alone doesn't dissolve the pattern. Instead, Freud recognized that true psychological change requires repeated engagement with the same issues, examining them from different angles, experiencing them in the therapeutic relationship, gradually integrating new understanding into emotional life. This process of working through could take months or years. It required patience from both analyst and patient, a willingness to return again and again to the same themes and conflicts, gradually wearing down old patterns through persistent attention and interpretation. This concept helps explain why psychoanalysis was such a long-term undertaking, why Freud believed that brief interventions could rarely produce deep change. Modern therapy still grapples with this insight, balancing the desire for efficient, time-limited treatment with the recognition that fundamental psychological change is often slow and requires sustained effort. Freud also wrote about what he called screen memories, seemingly trivial childhood memories that persist with unusual clarity and vividness. In an 1899 paper, Freud proposed that these innocent-seeming memories are actually stand-ins for more emotionally charged experiences that have been repressed. The mind preserves a safe memory, perhaps of a pastoral scene or a small domestic detail, that's associated through unconscious connections with something more significant that can't be directly remembered. For example, someone might have a vivid memory of picking flowers in a field as a child, a memory that seems oddly important despite being mundane. Freud would suggest that this memory might screen a more emotionally complex experience from the same period, perhaps a moment of loss or a family conflict. The flower-picking memory is preserved because it's connected associatively to the repressed event but doesn't carry the same emotional charge. Screen memories, like symptoms and dreams, reveal the unconscious mind's strategy of disguise and displacement, showing us something while hiding something else. Let yourself rest in quietness now, as we consider Freud's concept of sublimation in more depth. We touched on this earlier, but it deserves fuller attention because Freud saw it as perhaps the most important and successful defense mechanism. Sublimation transforms unacceptable impulses into socially valued activities. Sexual energy might be channeled into artistic creation. Aggressive drives might be redirected into competitive achievement or social reform. Curiosity about forbidden topics might become scientific investigation. Freud believed that civilization itself depended on sublimation. If everyone simply acted on their immediate impulses, pursuing pleasure and expressing aggression without restraint, social life would be impossible. But through sublimation, those same drives that could be destructive become the engine of culture, producing art, music, literature, scientific discoveries, technological innovation. The energy remains the same, but it finds expression in forms that benefit both the individual and society. Freud saw Leonardo da Vinci's artistic genius, Michelangelo's sculptures, Goethe's poetry, as examples of sublimation at its finest, raw instinctual energy transformed into humanity's highest achievements. This view suggests that our baser instincts aren't enemies to be destroyed but forces to be channeled. The person who becomes a surgeon and saves lives through cutting into bodies, the martial artist who transforms aggression into disciplined technique, the writer who explores forbidden desires through fiction, all are successfully sublimating. Freud would say that a well-functioning person and a healthy society both require robust opportunities for sublimation, acceptable outlets for energies that can't be directly satisfied but won't simply disappear. In his personal life, Freud practiced what he preached about sublimation. His own aggressive impulses, his competitive nature, his desire for recognition and influence, were channeled into his tireless work, his writing, his building of the psychoanalytic movement. His sexual energy, after his marriage became less passionate, seems to have been redirected into his intense intellectual creativity and his deep emotional investments in his ideas and his followers. His collection of antiquities satisfied an acceptable form his curiosity about human bodies, mortality, and the passage of time. Picture Freud in his study once more, late at night, everyone else asleep, his pen moving across the page, writing another case study, developing another theoretical refinement. The cigar smoke curls upward, the ancient figurines watch silently from the shelves, and Freud continues his life's work, transforming his own unconscious drives into theories that would illuminate the human condition for generations to come. He was, in a sense, his own best example of successful sublimation, channeling everything within him into understanding and expression. As you drift deeper towards sleep, perhaps you can recognize sublimation in your own life. The hobbies and passions that absorb you, the work that engages you fully, the creative outlets that bring satisfaction, these may be more than simple preferences. They may be elegant solutions your psyche has found, ways to express and channel impulses that might otherwise cause conflict, transforming raw energy into meaning and accomplishment. Freud would smile at this thought, that even as you rest, even as your conscious mind releases its hold, the unconscious continues its constant work, managing conflicts, creating compromises, finding ways to express what needs expression while protecting you from what you're not yet ready to know. Let that recognition comfort you, the knowledge that your mind is wiser than you know, always working, always adapting, always seeking the best possible solutions to the eternal tensions of being human. Let all tension melt away, as we continue our gentle exploration of Freud's world, discovering more of the intricate tapestry of his thought and life. One particularly important collaboration in Freud's early career was his work with Joseph Breuer, a prominent Viennese physician who became both colleague and mentor to the young Freud. In the early 1880s, Breuer treated a patient he called Anna O., whose real name was Bertha Pappenheim. She suffered from a range of mysterious symptoms: paralysis, speech disturbances, hallucinations, all with no apparent physical cause. Breuer discovered that when Anna O. talked about her symptoms and the circumstances under which they first appeared, often while under light hypnosis, the symptoms would temporarily disappear. She called this process the talking cure or chimney sweeping, describing how speaking about her troubles cleared away the psychological blockages. This case fascinated Freud deeply. He and Breuer collaborated on a book published in 1895 called Studies on Hysteria, which included Anna O.'s case along with others, and which laid the groundwork for psychoanalysis. The book introduced the idea that psychological symptoms could be traced to traumatic memories, and that bringing these memories to consciousness through talking could provide relief. However, the collaboration between Freud and Breuer eventually fractured. Breuer was uncomfortable with Freud's increasing emphasis on sexuality as the root of neurosis, and Freud felt Breuer was too cautious and conventional. They parted ways professionally, though Studies on Hysteria remained a foundational text, the beginning of the talking cure that would evolve into psychoanalysis. Interestingly, Anna O., or rather Bertha Pappenheim, went on to have a remarkable life after her treatment. She recovered from her symptoms and became a pioneering social worker and feminist activist, founding organizations to combat human trafficking and support women's rights. She never acknowledged publicly that she had been Breuer's famous patient, maintaining her privacy, but her later work showed a woman of considerable strength and social conscience. Some historians suggest that her symptoms may have been partly a rebellion against the constraints placed on intelligent, ambitious women in Victorian Vienna, her illness a form of unconscious protest. Now let your breathing deepen, as we explore Freud's concept of cathexis, a somewhat technical term but an important one. Cathexis refers to the investment of psychic energy in a particular object, person, or idea. When you cathex something, you direct libido toward it, you become attached, it gains emotional significance for you. A child cathects their mother, an adult cathects their romantic partner, an artist cathects their work. The amount of cathexis determines how important something is to you, how much it occupies your thoughts and feelings. Freud believed that we have a limited amount of psychic energy, and when energy is bound up in one direction, it's not available for other purposes. Someone who remains deeply cathected to a lost love from years ago might struggle to form new attachments. Their energy is still invested in the past. Someone whose energy is largely cathected to maintaining defenses and repressions has less available for creative work or genuine relationships. Successful therapy, in Freudian terms, involves freeing up bound energy, withdrawing cathexis from symptoms and past conflicts, making it available for more productive investments. The goal is greater psychic flexibility, the ability to direct your energy consciously rather than having it trapped in unconscious patterns. Another term Freud introduced that has become part of psychological vocabulary is reality principle. We discussed the pleasure principle earlier, the ID's drive for immediate gratification. The reality principle, by contrast, is what the ego operates by, the recognition that pleasure must often be delayed or modified to account for the actual constraints of the world. A hungry infant operates purely on the pleasure principle. It wants milk now, it doesn't understand waiting. But as we develop, we learn the reality principle. We learn that we can't always get what we want when we want it, that we must consider consequences, plan for the future, accommodate to circumstances. The tension between pleasure principle and reality principle creates much of psychological life. Too much reality principle, too much restraint and deferral, produces a joyless, overly controlled existence. Too much pleasure principle, too little ability to delay gratification, produces impulsive, self-destructive behavior. Healthy functioning requires a balance, the ability to enjoy pleasure when it's available while also tolerating frustration and working toward long-term goals. Freud saw maturity partly as the gradual ascendancy of the reality principle, not eliminating the pleasure principle but bringing it into relationship with how things actually are. Let yourself sink deeper into rest now, as we consider Freud's personal religious background and how it shaped his thinking. Freud was born into a Jewish family. His father Jacob was a wool merchant, and though the family was not religiously observant, Jewish identity was central to Freud's sense of self. Growing up in Vienna, Freud experienced anti-Semitism directly, the casual prejudice of Viennese society, the barriers to professional advancement that Jews faced. He later recounted a formative childhood memory, his father telling him about an incident where a Christian man had knocked Jacob's new fur cap into the mud and told him to get off the pavement, and Jacob had simply picked up the cap and walked away. The young Sigmund felt shame at his father's passivity, wished he had fought back, and this incident seems to have fueled Freud's own combative intellectual style. Despite rejecting religious belief, Freud remained proudly Jewish, identifying with Jewish history and culture. He saw himself as an outsider in Viennese society, and perhaps this outsider position gave him freedom to question assumptions that insiders took for granted. When he formed the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, most of its early members were Jewish, fellow intellectuals who faced similar barriers in the medical establishment. Later, Freud welcomed non-Jewish members like Carl Jung precisely because he hoped they could help psychoanalysis be seen as more than just Jewish science. But in the end, the Nazi persecution made brutally clear that psychoanalysis would be condemned as Jewish regardless of its actual membership. Freud wrote movingly about his Jewish identity in the preface to the Hebrew edition of Totem and Taboo in 1930. He said that while he couldn't read Hebrew and felt distant from Jewish religious tradition, he had never denied his Jewishness and felt a clear sense of Jewish identity based on many obscure emotional forces, the clear consciousness of inner identity, the safe privacy of a common mental construction. This beautiful phrase captures something important. Identity is emotional and unconscious as much as conscious and chosen, bonds that go deeper than belief or practice. Another fascinating element of Freud's theory involves the concept of object relations, how we internalize our early relationships and carry templates of them forward into adult life. Freud used the term object to refer to the target of our drives and emotions, usually people, especially in early life our parents and caregivers. The first objects are those who satisfy our needs, the mother who feeds us, comforts us, cares for us. We develop an internal representation of these objects, a psychological image that doesn't exactly match the real person but reflects our experience of them. These internalized objects become part of our inner world. We carry inside us not just memories but whole relational patterns, ways of being with others that we learned in our earliest experiences. If your early objects were reliable and responsive, you likely developed trust and secure attachment. If they were unpredictable or rejecting, you might struggle with anxiety and fear of abandonment. Later psychoanalysts, particularly Melanie Klein and others in the British Object Relations School, would develop these ideas much further. But Freud laid the groundwork, recognizing that we don't just remember our past relationships, we internalize them, they become part of the structure of our psyche. Consider now Freud's idea of secondary gains from illness. He observed that neurotic symptoms, while causing genuine suffering, often provided certain advantages or benefits that made them difficult to give up. A woman with a disabling phobia might receive extra attention and care from her family. A man with mysterious physical complaints might be excused from work he found unbearable. These secondary gains weren't the cause of the symptoms arose from unconscious conflicts, but the benefits they brought could reinforce them and make recovery more complicated. This concept helps explain why therapy is sometimes less straightforward than simply revealing the unconscious cause of a problem. Even when patients consciously want to get better, there may be unconscious resistance because the symptom serves a purpose, it solves a problem, even if in a costly way. A skilled analyst has to help the patient recognize these secondary gains, understand what needs the symptom is meeting, and find healthier ways to meet those needs. Only then can the symptom be relinquished. This insight remains valuable in modern therapy, the recognition that change involves not just eliminating problems but understanding what functions they serve and finding better solutions. Picture now the countless hours Freud spent with patients over his 50-year career, listening to their symptoms, their dreams, their memories, their associations. Each case was a puzzle, a mystery to be solved through patient attention and careful interpretation. Some patients improved dramatically, experiencing relief from symptoms that had plagued them for years. Others remained unchanged or even terminated therapy in frustration. Freud was honest about the limitations of psychoanalysis. He knew it wasn't a panacea, that some people weren't suitable for this kind of work, that even successful analysis left residual conflicts and vulnerabilities. But he believed deeply in the value of the endeavor. To understand oneself more fully, to bring unconscious patterns into awareness, to live with greater consciousness and choice rather than being driven by forces you don't recognize. This was worthwhile even when it was difficult and incomplete. Psychoanalysis offered not cure in a medical sense but rather self-knowledge, insight, a different relationship with one's own inner life. Freud sometimes compared the goal of analysis to transforming hysterical misery into common unhappiness, a modest-sounding aim but actually profound. To face life's genuine difficulties with clarity rather than being additionally burdened by neurotic suffering, to know yourself well enough to make real choices, this was liberation of a sort. As you rest now in deep comfort, let yourself appreciate the patience and dedication that Freud brought to his work. 50 years of listening, of thinking, of trying to help, of building a framework for understanding the invisible architecture of the mind. Not all his answers were right, but his questions opened new territories of thought, invited exploration where before there had been only mystery or moral judgment. Close your eyes and feel yourself drifting, carried on gentle currents, moving between conscious and unconscious, between memory and dream, your own psyche doing its nightly work of processing, integrating, balancing the many forces within you, just as it has done every night of your life, just as it will continue to do, the endless conversation between different parts of yourself. The eternal negotiation that makes you who you are.